Hey, it's Lou, and here's the thing. In 1930, a famous economist predicted his grandchildren's generation would work just 15 hours a week. Well, John Maynard Keynes, I'm from the future, and things did not work out that way. That generation is in the workforce, and they're busting their ass. Many are working longer hours than previous generations, and the pay is not climbing proportionately. This is a trend that both defies the predictions of a lot of smart people and has terrible consequences for our health and well-being. Overworked employees are also less productive and more prone to mistakes, so there's a business case for cutting workers some slack. The question is it time to shrink the 9-to-5 workday? Or how about a 3-day weekend? On average, full-time workers in OECD countries, that's a collection of the world's wealthier nations, log just over 40 hours a week. We've come to accept that number as pretty standard the world over, although there are some exceptions. But if you look at the historical data, 40 hours is sort of a prolonged plateau. If trends had continued, we'd all have a lot more free time. Consider the US. In the 1870s, your average working stiff spent a whopping 62 hours a week on the job. A century later, thanks to advances in technology and a rise in labor unions, that number had fallen all the way to 38.8. Experts expected the number to keep falling. In 1965, a U.S. Senate subcommittee forecast a 14-hour work week by the year 2000. In 1964, Life magazine ran a 2-part series on a real threat facing America, the impending catastrophe of too much leisure time. If only we had such problems. Nearly 40% of Americans say they work at least 50 hours a week, and we're not even in the top 10 OECD countries when it comes to hours worked. Mexico, Costa Rica, and Korea log the most hours every year. The problem is, too much work can contribute to burnout. That's a loss of motivation, a growing sense of emotional depletion, and an increase in cynicism. These symptoms overlap with the symptoms of depression, and in fact, working at least 11 hours a day is associated with a greater than 2-fold risk of having a major depressive episode. Research reveals that overwork could cause physical changes to your brain, literally thinning the frontal cortex, which can cause memory, focus, and emotional difficulties. A study in the UK found that workers who log excessive hours had worse vocabulary scores than their peers and experienced a larger decline in fluid intelligence. Meanwhile, studies link overwork to an increased risk of heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and alcohol abuse. Work often gets in the way of exercise and eating healthy. It's all a very bleak picture. A recent study concluded that health declines from work, including stress, account for 120,000 deaths every year in the US. That makes the workplace the 5th most leading cause of death in the country, in part because workplace suicides are on the rise too. The Japanese, a very work-centric culture, have a word for work-related death: karoshi. Amy Gordon, a social psychologist at the University of California, San Francisco, told me that overworking can also impair sleep, and when you haven't slept enough, she explained, you're more likely to see benign things as negative. Neutral faces appear to be frowns. A coworker's simple mistake is interpreted as an act of sabotage. Plus, when you're tired, you have a tendency to lose control, to lash out at others. Gordon told me to consider the contagion this could become. You yell at your coworker because you're exhausted and incorrectly thought her use of an exclamation mark in an email was aggressive. That puts her in a bad mood, so she gets impatient with the waiter at lunch. The waiter takes it out on the next customer, who then goes home and is shitty to her husband, and etc., etc., etc. It's like the opposite of pay it forward. And keep in mind, a lot of this behavior is self-reinforcing. It becomes a vicious cycle. So, if you want to understand the roots of all the incivility in the US, you might want to consider how the workplace is impacting the mood of the country. Now, these health issues, these mood issues, they're all problems for individuals, for employees. As an employer, it's tempting to see workers as disposable. These problems are not your problems. You squeeze as much juice from the lemon as possible and then discard it when it's no longer useful. However, John Pencavel, an economist at Stanford and author of Diminishing Returns at Work, The Consequences of Long Working Hours, told me that overworked employees may experience fatigue or stress that not only reduces productivity, but also increases the probability of errors, accidents, and sickness. All these things cost companies money. Mistakes can also damage reputations. I wonder, for instance, if Elon Musk's recent gaffes on Twitter have something to do with being a workaholic. His unforced errors have practically turned him into a poster child for why steady sleep and time away from the office is so important.
Last time I was here, I actually slept literally on the floor because the couch was too narrow.
Pencavel doesn't prescribe a certain number of hours that shouldn't be exceeded. He merely suggests that companies should experiment. That's what Henry Ford did in the 1920s when he reduced the work week from 6 to 5 days without cutting take-home pay. This wasn't out of compassion, it was out of self-interest. He found that his workers' output didn't suffer when they worked one less day. It actually increased efficiency. More recently, a hospital in Sweden switched a group of doctors and nurses to a 6-hour workday. They had to hire 15 new staff members at an expense of $123,000 a month to make up for the lost hours. But the unit went on to perform 20% more operations, meaning it generated business that would have gone to other hospitals. Perhaps more importantly, it improved the patient experience. Wait time for surgery shrunk. When people can get in and out of hospitals quicker, that has a positive impact throughout the economy. And keep in mind, exhaustion among health workers is a major issue. In the US, doctors in training can work up to 80 hours a week. Do you really want some fatigued, drained person making life and death decisions? Okay, another reason to reduce working hours. You should compensate employees for the things they get done, not the amount of time they spend on the clock. This is related to something called Parkinson's law, the idea that work expands to fill the time available for its completion. What we spend 8 hours doing could really be done in 6 if we were focused, if we cut out those Facebook breaks, leisurely lunches, and excessively long meetings. One survey found that over the course of an 8-hour day, the average employee works productively for just 2 hours and 53 minutes. Another study discovered that managers could not tell the difference between employees who actually worked 80 hours a week and those that just pretended to. Furthermore, there was no evidence that the longer hours resulted in additional accomplishments. Think about all that time at work not working. 2 things to consider. 1, that has an environmental impact. If offices could trim their hours and shut off lighting and heating, that saves CO2 emissions and lowers the utility bill. 2, if this surplus time was spent at home, maybe workers would be happier, and studies show that happier employees are more productive and more collaborative. Now, to be clear, avoiding burnout isn't just about working fewer hours. As one academic put it, burnout is, quote, the sum total of hundreds and thousands of tiny betrayals of purpose, each one so minute that it hardly attracts notice. Christina Maslach, a psychologist and professor emeritus at UC Berkeley, told me time off is just one component. Maslach, who's so influential in the field that the burnout scale bears her name, told me there are 6 matches between employees and their employers. And when there is significant misalignment in any of these matches, that's when burnout can kick in. She added that it's in an employer's best interest to foster these matches. A failure to do so is like buying a beautiful and expensive plant, but putting it in the wrong soil. Finally, there's a cultural problem at play here too. Gordon told me people love to brag about how little they sleep, how late into the night they were working. What they fail to mention is that they likely made more mistakes than usual during that all-nighter. Maslach agreed, adding that people are reluctant to talk about the depression, relationship problems, and cognitive issues associated with burnout. But if we got over that taboo, if we heard the sad ending to that heroic all-nighter story, people might be more inclined to say, hey, this is too much. I need a break. Because the thing is, over the last half-century, we sort of earned a break. There have been incredible technological advances, automation, artificial intelligence, robotics, computing in general. All of this should have made our burdens at work less time-consuming, but they haven't. We're always chasing more, adding to our professional to-do list. But maybe we're running a rat race simply out of muscle memory. Maybe it's not necessary anymore. Perhaps we can get on that leisurely path predicted for us and move towards a 6-hour workday or a 3-day weekend. I mean, what's the point of making money if you don't have the time or energy to enjoy it? Okay, I'm gonna go live my life.
Would you walk us through a typical day for you?
I just stare at my desk, but it looks like I'm working. I do that for probably another hour after lunch too.